Among the other motivations that the Europeans had for expanding their imperialist control in the late 19th century also has to do with their sense of cultural superiority, because they saw that their religion, or thought that their religion, was superior to that of all the people that they came into contact with. So part of it is that, like previous colonial projects, there were thousands of missionaries, both Catholic and Protestant, who were sent to Africa and to Asia to convert people. One of the countries that was very especially active in this were the French. But this idea that the cultural and religious superiority of the Europeans is needed by the people they're coming into contact with, that can also be seen in this image here, called the light of the world. And when you look more closely at this one here, it should be fairly obvious how they saw imperialism. Notice that you have a woman all decked out in white, which of course is a symbol of purity, holding a cross that's shining the sort of light, which is the light of the world, into the darkness there. Just in case you didn't know that she represented Christianity, it says Christianity above her head. Next to her, she is holding the hand of someone who has civilization written above their head, and they have tools on their back like a shovel and a pickaxe. They also have like a compass, and they have other measuring devices with them. They're bringing with them that civilization that you see far into the background there. You see it's either going to be telegraph or telephone. You're going to see the locomotive that's there. You see skyscrapers, right? And what are they dispelling? Well, they're dispelling these things like superstition, ignorance, and tyranny. Now, you wouldn't think that was necessarily connected to imperialism until you look at the animals that are used to represent this. So you have a tiger, fairly common to India. You have a tiger in other parts of Asia, that represents tyranny. You have what appears to be a large ape, perhaps a gorilla, could be a baboon. The idea being that those are going to be fairly indicative of Africa, at least from a European's perspective, and that's supposed to signify ignorance. Perhaps there's a direct reference to India and Southeast Asia with the large bat there that says superstition. And the idea is that Christianity and civilization will come in and they will dispel that darkness. Notice the clouds that they're driving away as well, by bringing them European religion and European civilization. All of these things point to the idea that the Europeans are, or that they think they are, superior to those who they are in charge of, and that these individuals and whole societies are less than them and require European guidance to reach their full potential. How effective was this? Well, by 1921, if you want to look at the British Empire consisted of 15 million square miles. That is one-third of the Earth's land. And they covered about 450 to even 550 million people, which was one quarter of the world's population. So by 1921, that's why, of course, there's the famous phrase regarding the British Empire that says the sun never sets on the British Empire, because they controlled lands all across the globe, so there was always some place in the British Empire where the sun was shining. Other countries had empires as well, but many of them were a lot smaller, but they're also gobbling up territories as well. Let's look at one of those places then. One of the main areas where we see this taking place is in Africa. And so what happens is that Africa had been actually, interior Africa had been unexplored by most Europeans until the end of the 1700s, until the 18th century. At the end of the 18th century, explorers and missionaries began making extensive journeys into Africa and mapping it out. One of the most famous is David Livingstone, a Scottish missionary and explorer that traveled throughout a lot of the interior of Africa in the 1850s and 1870s. But notice that's the middle of the 19th century. So we're several centuries after the beginning of the slave trade, where Europeans had contact with coastal Africa, but not interior. Anyway, back to Livingstone. His mission was to collect enough information about the continent to make missionary work, but also trade, more feasible. The information he and other explorers compiled allowed Europeans to realize the vast extent and resources in Africa. These discoveries then led to, in part, or these explorations then led in part to the foundation of the International African Association in 1876. That was begun by King Leopold II of Belgium. And it seems like with its name, the International African Association, and its mission, which was to explore and also civilize Africa, it seems like in terms of its name it might be benevolent, but it's not. Um, Leopold himself invited a lot of well-known scientists and wealthy philanthropists from all across Europe. Uh, the idea was that everyone was supposed to get together, work together, share information, all for the betterment of Africa. But what happened is all the delegates basically split off into national committees based on their own countries that worked together to gather information for their own nations. And that was going to be used for economic investment and colonization. So the meetings here then helped to rapidly increase the number of possessions. King Leopold himself claimed what ends up being called the Congo Free State. Italy, England, France, Germany all claimed parts of the Congo, in addition to other African kingdoms. All of this, of course, without any input of the Africans themselves. So this nationalistic competition caused the association to fall apart fairly quickly, which then led to the Berlin Conference of 1884-85. Otto von Bismarck of Germany calls a conference to settle all these diplomatic disputes of the European nations by basically dividing Africa up. At least 14 countries took part in this. Germany, the United States, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Belgium, Denmark, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Norway, Ottoman Empire. The results of this was that they'd all come together at the Berlin Conference to sort of hash this out. Was that the Congo Free State became the personal possession of King Leopold II, but the other 14 signers had rights to the Congo Basin. The Niger and Congo rivers were opened up to trading traffic. In some cases, they prohibited the slave trade, the sale of alcohol and guns in some region, and they all agreed to support missionary work. They also said that colonies were only considered a possession if not effectively occupied, and that that means also not occupied. Sorry, only if it was occupied by a European. Occupied by anybody else, it didn't count, and by anybody else, they meant Africans. All these meetings, first the International African Association, then the Berlin Conference, they all led to, they sped up the division of Africa so that by 1914, the entire continent was thoroughly divided, with only two areas, Ethiopia and Liberia, being not controlled by the Europeans. You can see that very clearly here in this map that shows Africa in 1885 at the beginning of the Berlin Conference. Notice that the majority of the possessions or territories that anybody controls are all coastal. Algeria, Tripoli, Egypt, and a little bit of Cape Colony, they all go into the interior a bit, but for the most part, sub-Saharan Africa, the area that's the Sudanese empires, Uganda, areas around what will become the Congo, the Bantu kingdoms in the middle, that's all basically unexplored and unclaimed. But within just a few decades, when you look at the map on the right, you see that all of Africa is divided up. All of Africa. You can see that the French have a huge chunk of West Africa, that the British have a massive section there that runs from Egypt in the north all the way down. It skips over the Belgian Congo, but then basically continues then in Rhodesia, the Orange Free State, South Africa. The Germans have several possessions there. The Italians have possessions. Even the Spanish get in on this. And of course, King Leopold has that center section there. There was no input from the Africans on this, which is why it's imperialism. They simply saw the continent and thought, hey, let's take it. And they did. So I want to give you an example of what happens in sort of two cases. One is British Africa, and the other is the Belgian Congo. In British Africa, one of the areas we'll really want to look at is Cape Colony in South Africa. All of these are in the south, and the British had actually been there for quite some time, but really when it started rolling was by the time of the late 19th century. So here it says 1815. That's when they first sort of arrived. They weren't the first people there, actually. The Dutch farmers called Boers were there in the south. And that's going to lead to a lot of conflicts between the British and them. The Boers themselves were farmer settlers who had claimed a lot of land in the South. And unfortunately for them, and you can see at the very, very bottom of the map, it says Boer Uprising there, and then just to the right it says 1899 to 1902, the Boer War. These territories that the Dutch farmers had control over, the British basically just took over and fought them, and it was this long series of guerrilla wars that lasted over 20 years, from 1880 to 1902, where the British were trying to stop the Boers and actually just put them down and thoroughly control the territory, which gives you an indication it wasn't just simply Africans that they were taking over, it was anybody who was in their territory. If you look at one of the leading figures in South Africa, that would be Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was an English businessman, and he is famous for founding territory named after himself, which you can see there sort of in the center. Center south, Rhodesia, because of course he has no ego at all whatsoever for naming a country after him. He invested in diamond mining in South Africa. He became the prime minister of the Cape Colony from 1890 to 95, right in the middle of those Boer Wars. In fact, he was one of the most instrumental persons in promoting British imperial prerogatives against that of the Boers during that time. He argued that the best way to assert British superiority was to take over, well, essentially take all of Africa, or at least all of the British parts of Africa, and connect them. He wanted to build a railroad from Egypt all the way to South Africa, called the Cape to Cairo Railroad. You can see Cairo is all the way in the north there in Egypt, and Cape Town is all the way in the south, and the idea was to create a rail line connecting them. The idea was it'd unify their possessions, it would facilitate trade, also help the military move to trouble spots. Most of the tracks were actually laid, but as you can see, they don't control all the territory, and so it wasn't finished and connected all the way. There were some geographic problems, but the British didn't control all the territory, and they ran into opposition from France, Germany, and others who opposed the railroad. Rhodes himself was often referred to, because of this grand plan that he had, he was often referred to as the Colossus of Rhodes. Now, the Colossus was one of the wonders of the ancient world, and the Colossus of Rhodes, spelled like his last name, was a huge statue that stood astride the harbor of the island nation of Rhodes. A massive statue there, and ships would actually sail underneath it between its legs to get into the harbor. But it becomes this sort of massive symbol of the ancient world in engineering. Well, Rhodes himself was essentially this colossus, not only because of his name, but the idea was that he was this overpowering personality that controlled all of the British holdings at one time, it seemed. And so he simply dominated that. In fact, you can really see the way in which he is portrayed as the colossus in this image here, trying to be very much like the ancient statue, where he has 2 feet firmly planted on Africa, one all the way in the north in Egypt, and one all the way to the south in Cape Town. Notice he is not wearing civilian attire, but he is wearing British military attire. He's carrying a weapon, he has a pith helmet, and he either has a line that is meant to measure the territory to show you just how far they have. Perhaps it's something as innocuous as telephone lines or telegraph lines, but it's probably something more for measurement. But the idea here is that this is a really profound symbol of British imperialism. The idea that they simply control this entire territory, and there is no input from the Africans, or even other Europeans, really. And that's sort of at the heart of British imperialism, and imperialism during this time in general.